Members of the town board, I want to ask you about the A fund balance and the decision to restrict the Department of Community Resources funding from the unincorporated budget. Let me give you some background first. The town charges some services to the entire town, including its villages. In 2010, Supervisor Paul Feiner touted the following townwide services in his budget: senior meals, civil defense, child care, and recreation programs for the developmentally disabled residents. In 2011, Mr. Feiner noted that the town took over dog licensing, quote, at the request of the villages. Addressing townwide services, he wrote, quote, "I've seen the smiles on faces of children with disabilities, and they are participating in the recreation programs tailored for their needs. I know how grateful seniors are when they see the nutrition worker provide them with food," end quote. With respect to the recreation program of the developmentally disabled, he further stated, quote, "I am proud that we have given children with special needs the opportunity to enjoy the quality of life and thank the villages for requesting this program," end quote. The services I just mentioned are clearly essential to the health and well-being of the entire town, including the villages. Therefore, providing them and funding them on a townwide basis makes sense. But the town's Department of Community Resources, which operates Theodore Young, is just as essential and therefore deserves townwide funding support. I'll read to you the Theodore Young mission. Theodore Young seeks to improve the quality of life of Greenburgh residents by providing a variety of educational, cultural, recreational, and social programs and services. It is our multifaceted approach by which we endeavor to lessen the problems caused by poverty, racism, and cultural deprivation. Does anyone in this room think that TDY is less essential than the other services that Greenburgh provides townwide? Of course not. Theodore Young is a lifeline for our neediest residents. Therefore, the town has some moral imperative to support its less fortunate using social services resources at its disposal in all parts of the town, including the villages, regardless of whether or not the villages have requested them or not. Now is the time, with the town holding historically high reserves in its townwide fund balance, to transition Theodore Young to more stable town funding. This wouldn't adversely impact village taxpayers. The town has sufficiently available townwide cash on hand to allow the funding transition of Theodore Young to occur with little or no economic impact to the taxpayers. These unencumbered reserves, known as unassigned fund balances, have grown at a rapid pace since 2014, long before Donald Trump came in office and suggested state and local tax reductions, and are projected to reach more than $19.3 million at the beginning of 2018. By drawing it down a mere fraction of these reserves to the benefit of Theodore Young, the town could gradually phase in any tax effect, which would be negligible to begin with. At the last board meeting, you failed to provide any acceptable answer for your access to those townwide reserves, and today's doesn't really align with what's been happening anyways. You said you had a policy which we reviewed. Your projected fund balance of more than $19 million is multiples over the maximum band of that policy. Why is that? Mr. Feiner and Ms. Judner, do you have a better answer this month for the outsized fund balance? And Mr. Feiner, please don't say that you need that much fund balance to maintain your prized AAA bond rating. You get the bond rating in 2010 when the town had a fund balance of $10.9 million and maintained it even when the fund balance dropped to $1.8 million. The rating agencies and the bond investors won't care if it drops so long as it's well planned and has a reasonable explanation. Also, at the last town board meeting, you failed to provide any acceptable answer for your decision to restrict Theodore Young to the unincorporated area and denied it access to the $9 billion of village tax base. When we asked you why Theodore Young was only funded by the unincorporated area, the answer for the controller was, because that's the way it's always been done in the past, quote unquote. Obviously, that's an inadequate response and one we find incredibly troubling. Please don't say that you can't legally fund Theodore Young on a townwide basis because it's a recreational facility. The Parks Department mission is, quote, to be responsive to the leisure needs of its residents. A quick reading of the Theodore Young's mission by comparison will debunk that in a second. Theodore Young was clearly established for reasons that are far more important than recreation and leisure. And any portion of Theodore Young's activities that are designated for recreation are intended to, quote, lessen the problems caused by poverty, racism, and cultural deprivation. As has been explained in emails to you and our legislators at the state level, the town has chosen to classify the agency as a second recreation department. In the court where the matter was actually litigated, the judge found that it wasn't illegal for you to do so, nor did it say it was illegal for you to change the classification either, and as Theodore Young performed both social and recreational services, So don't claim that the court ordered the classification, because that's not at all what happened. By classifying Theodore Young as you have, Greenburgh is the only municipality we know of in the entire country that operates 2 separate recreation departments, despite the fact Theodore Young offers after-school programs, summer youth employment, parenting skills counseling programs, financial skills counseling programs, college tours, senior services, leadership and conflict resolutions for classes for teenagers, and of course recreation, again for the purposes of lessening the problems caused by poverty, racism, and cultural deprivation. All of these programs, including that subset of recreation, are social in nature and available townwide. In a recently foiled email from Paul Feiner, Mr. Feiner stated that only 6% of Theodore Young users reside in the villages. While it's unclear whether or not that data is even accurate, Mr. Feiner uses the statistic as a reason to justify the villages not paying for Theodore Young. Mr. Feiner, if you were willing to cite the usage of Theodore Young, do you know the same stats for other social services that the villages do fund? And what, in your mind, is the right level of village usage of Theodore Young where you believe the villages should pay? Does Theodore Young get the same treatment in your mind as other social services? Actually, should usage even matter here at all? Irvington probably has a few residents on public assistance, but it still pays the county taxes to support programs for people who need them. Should we ask George Latimer to exempt Irvington residents from having to pay for those services? Whether or not we are individually affected by the forces of poverty, racism, or cultural deprivation, or even have ever set foot in Theodore Young, is irrelevant to the town providing the social services for those who do. Now let's assume for a second that you really believe that Theodore Young is the same as the Parks and Rec Department, despite their starkly different mission statements. Why hasn't the town merged it with the Parks and Rec Department to reduce the duplicative expense burden on the unincorporated taxpayers? In effect, you should either say it is a social service and give it access to the townwide funds and tax base, or merge it with the Parks and Rec and reduce the tax burden on the unincorporated constituents. But merging it isn't really an option because it's not a Parks and Rec department. In fact, what we've learned is that classifying Theodore Young as recreation takes advantage of a home rule legal loophole, but that classification doesn't change what Theodore Young actually is. Greenburgh nor any municipality would ever have 2 entirely separate police departments, 2 entirely separate DPW departments, or 2 entirely separate recreation departments. If you finally change the classification of Theodore Young for what it actually is, Theodore Young would be entitled to the benefits of a sustainable revenue stream that would protect it from the competing budget needs of the Parks and Rec Department, the DPW, the Police Department, and of course, future village incorporations, Edgemont or otherwise. Look, it's never too late to make a positive change. The $19.3 million that all town taxpayers have on deposit with the town offers a historic opportunity to provide equitable funding to Theodore Young, an essential agency that offers critical services to some of Greenburgh's most vulnerable citizens. These types of services are not provided by the villages. While the villages have their own recreation department, no village in Greenburgh offers services comparable to Theodore Young's. Thus, the town's long-standing and disingenuous labeling of Theodore Young as yet another entirely separate recreation facility that a subset of the entire town uses is incredibly troubling, particularly in the context of today's national discussion. Up until now, you, the town board, have refused to discuss the matter because, according to Councilman Jones, the village's officials have indicated they really don't want their residents paying for such services. Really? That's the answer? We in Edgemont believe that Theodore Young deserves to be funded and that all areas of the town should support it since it's available to all areas. Whether or not Edgemont incorporates, the EIC believes this matter is worthy of your attention. The time is right for you, our local representatives, to finally move to the right side of history and ensure that Theodore Young is funded using the most stable and sustainable resources the town can possibly authorize.
Some people have suggested moving the Theater Community Center budget and the Greenburgh Nature Center budget to the A budget, and I think this is just a publicity, initiative that really doesn't make sense at this time. If you look at the community center budget only about 6 to 7% of those residing, in the only 6 or 7% of people in the villages use the Theodore Young Community Center. The budget's about $5 million, and I think that the EIC presents a scenario, and they're trying to reduce. They're trying to make people think that the Theodore Young Community Center is going to be safe and will continue operations if they're in the A budget. But when you really think about it, if you have only 6 or 7% of the people in a community, outside in the villages using the center budget, what's going to happen is center programs. What's going to happen is there's going to be less support for the community center from residents of villages in the future. So I think if you put the community center in the A budget, there's not going to be a very active, as many programs and as much community support, because a lot of people in the villages are going to say, why fund it? They're not going to be, as supportive. I've spoken to people in the villages, people in Dobbs Ferry, people in Irvington, people in Hastings, people in Ardsley. They don't use the center, and they're not going to want to continue, funding, the center. I also, that's one of the major concerns, that I have.
11.3 million is the number of dollars you have in your town-wide A budget over and above your maximum policy. That's 2.5 times the allowable amount. So last meeting, I asked you, why do you have so much? Ms. Judner, you said it's a policy. Now, that means two things to me. One of two things is true. Either you gave that answer and you had no idea what the policy was, or you gave that answer and you knew what the policy was and you knew that you were in major violation of the policy. One of those two things was true. But then I was told by Mr. Lewis that I would get an answer to the question as to why we were so over budget in this meeting. So I got an answer. And the answer was, it's because of state and local taxes. That was the reason. But you also failed to have any understanding of what I said earlier and answer any of the questions that were posed at the last meeting, which is the budget has been going up at or near the tax cap for the past 5 years. And since 2014, you've been way outside of the budget range. So my question is, prior to the Trump presidency and prior to there being a Republican Congress that would have even thought of approving the state and local tax cap deduction, why on earth is the policy so high? You still haven't provided an answer, or you're knowingly misleading the public. One of the two things are true. I don't know which it is. But you can't sit there and tell me about how open and how transparent you want to be when you give these types of answers. That's the problem. That's it. And that's before we even get into the FOIL conversation. Mr. Feiner, after I had an entire conversation about people, you're saying that there was some data that you had that apparently you can't source that says 6% of people in the villages use Theodore Young. I would like to know from where you got that data. We just had an entire conversation with the town planner about how you were going to go and interview and gather information from the public about whether or not the change in zoning was problematic. Have you literally gone out and asked people in the villages using email list, notices, or anything? How many people have actually said to you, I am fine in paying for and supporting from our taxes developmentally disabled people and senior meals, but I have a massive problem supporting people who have had problems as a result of racism? I'd like to know who are those people and how many of them you actually supported, and where's the data to support your 6% argument?